So a major part of Truth and Reconciliation is acknowledging the impacts of residential schools on Indigenous peoples across what is now called Canada. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker for this session, Dr. Tiffany Hind Bull-Prete. Dr. Hind Bull-Prete is a member of the Blood Tribe of the Blackfoot Confederacy. She's an assistant professor at the University of Lethbridge and holds a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Resiliency. She is also the curator of the exhibit downstairs right from here, Stolen Ghana Children, Stories of Survival. That exhibit is on loan from the Galt Museum and Archives until November 5th. Her program of work is grounded in implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action on the Blood Reserve. That's a big job. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Tiffany Hind Bull-Prete.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for allowing me to be here today to share my work with you. Oki, Nistu, Nidanako, Apooyak'ii. As I've already been introduced, I'm also an intergenerational survivor of the residential school system, and I have dedicated the last decade of my life researching the history of colonization, specific to the Blood Reserve, and focusing on the impacts of the colonial school system. And so I would also like to acknowledge and give thanks to my chief and council who've approved the research study that I'll be sharing with you today. And I'm going to give a bit of a brief introduction to this research project before I get into the main part of my talk today. And so I'm here to share with you truths that are not easy to hear. They are truths about what the Canadian government and the different religions who were on the Blood Reserve tried to take from us and to erase. Our children, our families, our languages, and our traditional way of life. And since childhood, I have often been asked, why can't you just get over it? It was a question that I could not answer at that moment in my life. And as a child, I realized that there was something going on around me, but I couldn't articulate what I was seeing and experiencing and feeling as someone who's been colonized. As a child, I didn't understand all of this. And over time, I learned fragments about residential schools from my family members who are survivors, though they rarely spoke about their experiences. And still, I understood it was a history of deep significance to my people, and I was determined to learn more. My research has taken me into archives across Canada, and collaborating with elders from my community, I have worked to piece together our blood history of colonization and residential schools. And through this journey, I have sought to understand not only my own family's silence, but also why my people continue to face such profound inequalities today. And so at its core, my work is about uncovering the policies and histories that shape our present circumstances. And one of the key findings from my research is that the government didn't rely on just one system of schooling to assimilate us. They created several different school models. And what I mean by school models, today we have public schools, private schools, charter schools, and Catholic schools. And in a similar sense, the government made several different types of schools to try and assimilate Indigenous children. Residential schools were only one school model in a much larger colonial project. Behind them were deliberate policies, calculated strategies, and government debates that intentionally designed how these schools would operate. These decisions weren't neutral. They were built to control, to erase, and to assimilate. The results was a system that endured for over a century on First Nations reserves, leaving behind generations of harm and trauma that we're still confronting today. And so I'm going to share with you all of the different school models that the Canadian government tried to assimilate Indigenous children. And before I do get into speaking about these school models, I did want to review some facts about the Blood people, where I am a member from. So we are the largest land-based reserve in Canada. We have one of the largest band memberships, and Because of these reasons, education on my reserve, to my understanding from these records, is a little bit different than how other First Nations reserves operated. And so what I am sharing with you today is very specific to the Blood people. How education unfolded on other reserves may not be the way that education unfolded for the Blood people. So I'm going to I gave you the introduction. I'm going to talk about the different school models, and then we'll end with a Q&A. So the very first school model is day schools. And what made day schools possible is because we entered into Treaty 7. So this is a map of all the treaties in Canada. We can see where Treaty 7 is in Niitsitapi traditional territory. And once we were confined to our reserves, so we have a map of Niitsitapi traditional territory. We have 4 tribes. We have Siksika here by Calgary, Piikani by Pincher Creek, and then we've got Ghana, where I'm from, by Lethbridge, and then we have Amskapi Piikani, which is found in the United States in Montana. And so once we were confined to our reserves, it would be easier for missionaries to come and to make mission homes and to open up schools. And on the Blood Reserve, we had 3 Christian denominations who came. We had the Methodist with John McLean, the Anglican with Samuel Trevette, and we had Emile Legal, who is an oblate of Mary Immaculate with the Roman Catholic religion. And these were the first 4 sisters who came to amongst the Blood people, the Grey Nuns of Nicolay, who is also part of the Roman Catholic religion. And this is a picture of one of the Roman Catholic day schools. It's not in operation at the time that they took the photo, but you can see that they were very just simple buildings that they used back then. The curriculum that they used during day schools was what they called the 3 R's, which was reading, writing, and arithmetic. And the government contributed in those days either beef and flour or dry milk powder and biscuits. And if the Anglicans ran out of biscuits, they would just not even attempt to hold school. They would wait until the next shipment of biscuits came and open the school again. The Roman Catholics would give biscuit as a reward. If they could get children to sit from 9 to 12, they would get a biscuit. And if they would sit from 12 to 3, they would get another biscuit. I want to share a memory from one of our elders from the Blood Reserve named Elder Kate Shade. She said one day, the nuns came out with big baskets of cookies and buns, which they distributed throughout the camp. After that, my mother and her friends attended school every day. The nuns taught them English and prayer, and that was the beginning of our formal Roman Catholic education. But there was a problem for the churches and the government. The day schools didn't work the way that they had hoped. Children went home at the end of the day and continued to speak Blackfoot and to continue to be with their families. And so we remained very much still to our culture and our language. And so the government decided that day schools were not enough to erase us. And so when day schools failed, the government created industrial schools. And these schools were far away from our reserves, so parents could not interfere. The industrial schools that mainly serviced Treaty 7 children, we had St. Joseph, that was more commonly referred to as Dumbo. It was Roman Catholic. And we also have St. Dunstan, which was Anglican, and it was more commonly referred to as the Calgary Industrial School. In 1884, the Indian Act was amended to make school attendance mandatory for children ages 6 to 15, but parents could choose. They could send their child in their village to a day school, or they could send them hundreds of miles away to an industrial school. And most parents chose to keep their children in closer proximity in the day schools, which is very upsetting to the principals of the industrial schools, as they had hoped to get young children where they thought that they would be in a better position to mold them. And so in industrial school, their education was promised to trades. And so I have a couple pictures of just some of the trades that they learned. This is Battleford Industrial School. The children were learning how to make furniture. In St. Joseph Industrial School, the Dumbo one here close to Calgary, they had one just for girls, and it was learning how to sew. We have the Carlisle Indian Industrial School that's in the United States, and they were learning how to make shoes. And, you know, even though that they were learning these trades, they they were still children that were laboring in the schools, being starved, and still being abused. Some parents resisted sending their children to the industrial schools, and some would travel long distances to come and take their children back. And at that time, under the Indian Act, parents had the right to do so, but every return home was met with pressure and sometimes even with threats. Behind it all, children endured hunger, beatings, and sexual violence at the hands of their teachers in these institutions. So this is a picture of some of the children who attended St. Joseph's, so the Dumbo Industrial School. And as I was going through the records, I came across the story of Johnny Blood, who is a member of the Blood tribe. And so they don't name all the children in this photo, but this was the year that he was attending, so he should be one of the children in this photograph. Johnny arrived with what the records described as having a sore knee. Over the course of months, his condition worsened until staff amputated his leg, leaving him in constant pain and in constant need of the infirmary. In September 1891, he died from complications of that amputation. And that really broke me when I read that. He died alone, far away from his family, without the comfort of his people. His short life exposed the cruel reality of industrial schools, places where Indigenous children were not nurtured, but neglected, and too often buried. Next, we have boarding schools. When industrial schools failed, the government and churches decided to create another school model. And boarding schools were placed back on reserves, but they would be away from the villages and far enough to sever children from their families. We had two that opened on the Blood Reserve. We have the St. Paul's Anglican that opened in 1892. It was on what we call Apooyak'ii, so Big Island. There were rivers that surrounded it, and you had to get there by boat, making it a very strategic place to put children because it was very hard for them to run away. And this is Immaculate Conception that is Roman Catholic, and it opened in 1898. The curriculum was split, half day of academics, half day of domestic or agricultural labor, with, of course, the religious instruction that they had to receive each day. So these are some of the children who attended the Roman Catholic Immaculate Conception. This is some of the clubs that they had at the Anglican school that was to further try and assimilate Indigenous children. For the girls, they had Girl Guides, and for the boys, they had a cadet program. So this is a picture of one of the intake ledgers for Immaculate Conception on the Blood Reserve. And on the first page, it lists 34 children that are enrolled. Of those 34, 20 of them never made it home. And that's a mortality rate of about 59%. More than half of the children died within the walls of that school. Imagine sending your child to school and never seeing them again. Imagine entire families watching generation after generation of children vanish. This is not just a statistic, it is a remembrance of lives stolen. Each number represents a child with a name, a family, and a future that was never lived. These were not accidents. They died from neglect, abuse, malnutrition, disease, and despair. In the 1920s, boarding schools were officially renamed to residential schools, and two new ones were built on the Blood Reserve. We have the Roman Catholic St. Mary's, and we also have the Anglican St. Paul's. Residential schools combined what the boarding and industrial schools taught, so there was the academics, but as well there would be trades, domestic labor, and again, the religious instruction. And these are some photos of St. Paul's dormitory, the trades that they were learning at St. Paul's. Again, they continued on with programs to further assimilate. So we have Girl Guides. They also had a marching band. In the summertime, they would have summer camps up in Waterton, and it was very intentional that they held it in the summer. It's at a time that we engage in ceremony, so we have our Apooyak'ii, and that is the time that they would take the children away up to Waterton to go to camp. It would take days to get there from the boarding or residential schools, so it would make it very hard for the children to try and run away and partake in any of the ceremonies. By the 1940s, some of the residential schools became sites of larger scale nutrition experiments. Both of the residential schools on the Blood Reserve were chosen for these studies, and the government researchers led by Lionel Pett deliberately withheld milk, vitamins, and other essential nutrients from children. Some groups were given supplements, others were left malnourished, all to measure the effects of deprivation. These experiments were not hidden mistakes, they were sanctioned by the state. Ian Mosby's research later revealed how the data was used to shape post-war nutritional policy. Pett himself went on to author Canada's first official food guide. So this is more pictures of the children, Roman Catholic. They had sports teams and in their dining hall. And so this was the official foods rule in 1942, the foundation of what would become the Canadian Food Guide. So while settler families across the country were told to drink more milk, eat fortified bread, and follow new nutritional guidelines, Indigenous children in residential schools were systematically denied those very foods. The policies that nourished the Canadian population were built on the backs of Indigenous children who were starved in residential school, like the children who attended St. Paul's and St. Mary's. And this reminds us that residential schools were not only sites of cultural oppression, but also of medical experimentation, places where children's suffering was exploited in the name of progress. The government strategy, at first, they isolated children to try and assimilate them into a Euro-dominant Western society. And they tried to do this through day school, industrial schools, boarding schools, and residential schools. And when that failed to assimilate Indigenous children, they decided that they should try assimilation through integration. And they believed that mixing Indigenous children with non-Indigenous children, especially in public schools, would be situate them in a better way to assimilate them more effectively. And they hoped that the children would come home every day and be able to have that rub off on their parents as well. So far, the assimilation through segregation that we've covered, we've gone through day schools, industrial schools, boarding schools, and residential schools, and we'll move on to the school models that were used under the assimilation through integration. So starting in the 1940s, public schools were introduced, but school districts resisted. There was some apprehension from the school officials and the non-Indigenous parents about allowing Indigenous children into their schools. Indigenous parents also feared what would happen to their children if they went into these schools and the type of racism that they would experience. Many of the blood children were rejected from neighboring schools. I want to share a story from one of the elders from the Blood Reserve, who is also one of my relatives. This is Elder Nora Baldwin. She said, "I was encouraged by Canon Middleton," so this is a picture of her and Canon Middleton, who was the high school principal at St. Paul's where she was attending. "I was encouraged by Canon Middleton and my parents to further my education. The place which was chosen for me to attend was Bedford High School in Saskatoon, because natives were not accepted at the Cardston High School, and so that would have been the closest high school to those who were attending school on the Blood Reserve. After matriculation, I was again encouraged to continue my education, so I chose nursing as my profession. I was admitted to the Royal Jubilee Hospital in Victoria, British Columbia, and I graduated as a registered nurse in 1945. So Nora had to travel 687 kilometers before she could find a public high school that was willing to take her in as a student. Grade 12 would not be offered on the Blood Reserve until 1960. So this is the first graduating high school class that they had on the Blood Reserve. If you wanted to get a high school diploma, you had to go off reserve and find a high school that was willing to take you. And so there was also something that the Canadian government created called boarding out. And so if you attended an Anglican school on the reserve, they would try to board you out with an Anglican family. And so this was also very traumatic for the children. And they continue to also sadly experience abuse in some of these placements that they were put in. Boarding out was not about education. It was about control, forcing Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian households where every part of their lives was monitored and policed. Next, we have residency schools, and they were still considered residential schools, but their operation differed a little bit under the assimilation through integration regime. And so they were sometimes referred to as residencies or as hostels, but the harm they caused was still the same. During this time, the government claimed that it was phasing out residential schools. And so at that time, on the Blood Reserve, the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church, they resisted this call, but the Anglican Church did eventually comply with that shift. And by the 1960s, their residential school solely became a residency. And so children still lived there, but they were bussed out each day to attend public school. So this is a picture of some of the children who were part of that program. St. Paul's officially closed at the end of that decade, and the Roman Catholic Church resisted far more fiercely, and they were recorded as being one of the very last residential high schools in all of Canada, and it closed in 1988. At the same time, the government introduced funding formulas to speed the demise of residencies and on-reserve education, giving more money for children enrolled in public schools than for those who would stay on reserve. And they worked to remove the churches from the system altogether. So oblate priests were replaced as principals, and nuns were dismissed and were no longer allowed to be a part of the education system. And so we see this shift of control back into the Department of Indian Affairs. This was not the end of assimilation, but it was the state claiming sole authority over it. The name has changed and the policies have shifted, but for Indigenous children, the inequities remained. They were still uprooted, still controlled, still denied their languages and cultures, and the system has not ended. It has simply taken on a new form. In the 1950s, the government introduced non-denominational day schools. They were meant to sever ties with the churches. Qualified teachers were very hard to find at that time to convince them to come onto reserve. And so the only people that they could find who were willing to come were the same priests and nuns who they had previously dismissed. And so the non-denominational day schools were run just as though they were religious schools. Abuse continued under a new name. Day schools were meant for the children who lived too far away from the residency schools for their parents to drop them off every day, and that either they couldn't find a public school that was willing to take them, or they didn't want to go off reserve to go to a public school. And so they created a non-denominational day schools for those children in particular. And these are some pictures of some of the day schools that were opened. We had one in Standoff in the community of Laverne. The residency and the day schools would eventually transition into federal schools. And in 1988, the Blood Tribe took local control of education. And today, the Kainai Board of Education runs 5 schools. And we also have our own community college. So we have a community school, an elementary school, a middle school, an alternate school, as well as a high school. And then we have Miigate that we named after our head chief at the signing of Treaty 7. And so in the top left, you can see that is what previously was the St. Mary's Residential School. Once it closed, Red Crow Community College opened, and it burnt down about 10 years ago. And it has been since then rebuilt in Standoff. You can see in the bottom right corner, it's been open for just over 3 years now, and it's a very beautiful building. If you ever get the opportunity to go and visit, they've curated beautiful art from members throughout Blackfoot Confederacy. This is Dr. Roy Weaselfat, who was the former president of McGate's. He just recently stepped down. And I wanted to read a quote that I think is very salient, and that captures what our tribal education system tries to do in our K-12 as well as in our post-secondary. Dr. Roy Weaselfat says, open quote, "One of our main advantages as a First Nations college is that we have direct access to our community elders and their traditional way of knowledge. We have had an Elders Advisory Council for more than 2 decades. They help our students connect with their culture and with our Blackfoot ways of living and being, how we come together as a Blackfoot community, how to continue the practices of teaching this culture to our community. Once people return back into the culture, it has a transformative effect. People change once they know. And for me, success is when a member of our community experiences success in education and in life. It is my obligation to pass on this knowledge of success to our students and other members of the community so that they may enjoy the benefits of post-secondary education and lead a better life, so they may benefit from the new buffalo as their ancestors benefited from the buffalo. That's what I want for our students." So these are all of the school models that we reviewed today under the assimilation through segregation, day schools, industrial schools, boarding schools, residential schools, and under the assimilation through integration, public schools and the boarding out program, residency, non-denominational day schools, and federal schools. So these truths are not easy to hear, and they're not meant to be easy. The Stolen Children era was a deliberate policy of the Canadian government carried out by Christian denominations with the goal of erasing Indigenous peoples. Its impacts are alive today in every statistic of inequality, and I wanted to share with you some statistics to help contextualize what I mean by inequality. And these come from the latest statistics from Statistics Canada, as well as the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls final report. According to these statistics, Indigenous peoples have the highest rates of socioeconomic distress, are least likely to be employed, have a lower total income, have a lower life expectancy, have the lowest high school graduation rates, are overrepresented in custody and community programs, and are more likely to be the victims of violent crimes than any other ethnic or racial group in Canada. Indigenous women only represent 2.4% of the total Canadian population, but are 16 times more likely to be sexually assaulted, including raped, and are more likely to be beaten, battered, and or murdered than any other ethnic or racial group in Canada. Reconciliation is impossible without truth, and truth is meaningless without justice and change. And so I ask you, what will you do with what you have heard today? I hope that this truth stays with you and that you'll be able to find moments to share it, to teach it, and to help shape a better future. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we'll take some questions from the audience.
Where do you see Indigenous education moving forward into the future?
So in 1988, the Blood Tribe was able to take local control of education. So that means that we do have the ability to create an education system that is more in line with our own values and our own traditional way of life. The setback to that is we can create our own education, but it doesn't mean that any other post-secondary institutions have to accept that. And so if we want our children to go to college or to university, they do have to have a high school diploma that's recognized in Canada. And so currently we do follow the Alberta curriculum. And so while we still have to follow that, we are able to make some adjustments and changes to that to include our own knowledge systems. But again, it is kind of limiting in a way because we still do have to follow the Alberta curriculum. So it would be nice to be able to see some changes with that, where we have more freedom and acceptance from other post-secondary institutions and allowing our children into them, not having a Canadian high school diploma. Yeah, thank you.
Good question. Next question. Oh, there's one at the back here.
Thank you for such a great talk. I'm curious if you found that having the Catholic residential schools and the Anglican residential schools, if that was intentional, not just to assimilate the children, but to also divide the people along different religious lines?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I, working with my elders on this project, from what they shared with me, it really did create a big division amongst our people, whether you were Anglican or whether you were Roman Catholic. They would say that it's something that is not as big of a deal in the past couple of decades as it was maybe 50 years ago. And so if your family attended an Anglican school, like all of your children and your grandchildren would most likely also attend an Anglican school, and that would be the same thing for Roman Catholic. And so the government was very big on pushing Western ideology, as well as making us Christians. And so they wanted us to get married in these religions. Our own marriage ceremonies were not accepted. And so if there was ever a couple where one of them was Anglican and one of them is Roman Catholic, it was really frowned upon. And most of those religions would actually not allow them to get married. And so they wanted one or the other to convert to the other religion. And that did cause a lot of division in families. So if your family was Anglican, for so many generations, and you converted to Roman Catholic, it could sever ties in your family. And so there was sadly division that happened because of the religions and the way that they treated one another. As I've gone through the historical documents, I can see how poorly even just the religions treated one another, because they so badly wanted to try and convert members of the blood tribe into their religion. So they were very undermining. And I think that it wasn't a very good example. And I think we can kind of trace that back to the way that sometimes that we experience lateral violence in our own communities. Thank you.
Wow, that's really interesting. We have time for one more question. Oh, one question here.
Is the Apooyak'ii Reserve the only reserve that has been able to take over their education service, or have other reserves been able to as well?
Okay, thank you. The blood reserve is Ghana, and Apooyak'ii is a different reserve, but that's okay. There are other First Nations throughout Canada who have been able to do that, but not every First Nations have had that privilege to do so. And being a member of the blood tribe, I specifically focus on the blood tribe, and so I'm not aware of the other tribes in Blackfoot Confederacy if they have also taken local control, but I do know that there are many First Nations throughout Canada who have, but again, there are some who have not had the opportunity to yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think, do we have time? Just one more question here, and then we'll wrap it up, because I'm sure everyone's hungry.
Thank you. I have a question on, I actually attended the University of Lethbridge in 1998-99.
Can everyone hear? Okay. Yeah.
Is it working? Okay, there. I attended the University of Lethbridge 98-99 in land and sciences, and worked on the blood reserve grasslands area, and had to put up with 15 Western science departments when it came to actually trying to do the science. That was really difficult, and I'm just wondering if you have a bridging program for protection so that they can access the university in order to be successful. Not only the lateral violence, but even the teachers, the professors, some very inappropriate things happened. And I could see where some people would leave after that.
Yeah.
So my question is if you have a bridging program for safety and success.
a bridging program. The University of Lethbridge does have a First Nations, Métis, and Inuit transition program specifically for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, where they in their first year they give them all the skills that they need or what they think that they need to be successful in university. So they'll learn how to write papers, how to study, and they are then they take so many courses for the different faculties so that at the end of the year they can either walk away with a certificate if they decide that it's not for them, or they can go into a program. And so they already have some of the university courses there, but the transition is supposed to set them up in the best way to be successful. So they have that extra help. And so that's something that they do have in place right now. I'm not positive when they started it, but it is a program that they do have currently.
Go ahead, Sable.
I had a question about, do you know if there's any research or recording of stories of LGBTQ two-spirited students that went to residential school? I'm a day school survivor. I went to in Guyana. I went to St. Mary's. And I know that my uncle went there as well. And I know a number of people, but I don't know if anyone's recording their their stories. And I think it's important because, especially with the way transgender children, LGBTQ kids are being oppressed here in this province, the perception that two-spirited and transgender kids, that this is new. But for us, for our people, it was always, we were always here. We were always part of the culture. And I think it's really important that more research and recording of those stories is done. Thanks.
Thank you. And that is a very excellent point. In the research that I've been doing, a lot of it has been historical, and so that kind of there aren't any records really that talk about that. And then from an elders standpoint, the elders that I've worked with, that's not something that has come up, but I know that they were working as a tribe to collect elder stories. And so they do have the 4 volumes of stories of our elders that I think the first edition, I think it came out in the 1990s. They came out with a 4th volume. And I have heard talks that they are wanting to make another volume with our elders who are now who are more elderly, who haven't had a chance to have their voices and stories recorded. And so that, I think that would be something excellent if they're able to do that. But currently, I don't know of any research studies that focus on that.
Over here.
Oh, hi.
It's me again. Okay, hello.
Hi. Okay.
Hey, Sable, good question.
Yeah.
I was literally just talking to an elder this morning. And so this is fresh, hot research right now.
Oh, exciting.
Yeah. And so the way that the elders had put it is they were always accepted. They were part of the community, part of the clan. In fact, the males, would be heavily relied upon at camp because of their physique. But it was, so just this piece, so it wasn't until, so they noticed them just being a part of us. They were just a part of us. There was no pointing fingers, there's no labels, nothing like that. Because you could see for yourself with your eyes somebody. So nothing needs to be said. That's why the elders are always, you listen with, and what you do with this is, That's how you hear. And so he said, and they said, and just recently, it wasn't until the 80s until we started picking on ourselves. It wasn't until the 80s when they noticed that we started having our own prejudices against ourselves. So it was the oppression and subjugation of westernization and all of the Catholic upbringing that everybody had, Anglican, whatever religion they had, is where the prejudices were derivative from. So that's just the latest, hot off the press. It wasn't until the 80s that prejudices kind of started.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. A great question. We could do a whole other one on education and gender. I think you should come back for that, Tiffany. New thread, new research for you. Now we're going to end. Thank you so much again to our speaker, Tiffany.